5 seconds. And over the mic is all fueling go.
Did you know the press is the only industry specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
Stand by.
That's because a free and open press is critical to our democracy.
Track Alpha. Roll Alpha. Stand by, camera 1.
I'm Tom Hartman, and on this show we reveal the big picture of what's actually going on in the world. We go beyond identifying the problem.
We try to fix it.
Rational debate and a real discussion of the critical issues facing America.
Stand by, camera, go.
Ready to join the movement? Then welcome to the big picture. Hello, I'm Mike Papantonio in for Tom Hartman tonight. Here's what's coming up tonight on the big picture. Chances are, if you watch TV at night, you probably see a few ads for drugs, whether they're for high blood pressure or nagging headaches. But are those drugs really safe, or are they just money-making machines for big drug companies? Also, DuPont, one of the largest chemical companies in America, contaminated drinking water for more than 50 years, and they kept it a secret. Now those affected by the contamination, well, thank goodness they're fighting back. Question is, isn't it time we hold corporations accountable for their negligence and lack of caring for the American public? And America's demographics, well, they're changing, they're shifting quickly, and that means big changes to the political landscape in our country. How will Democrats and Republicans adjust in the years to come? Are both parties capable of doing that? That's the real question. Designer drug products are killing and crippling consumers all over the U.S. Typically, they have a way that they do that. There's certain steps they take. First, the industry capitalizes on direct-to-consumer advertising laws that are only legal, by the way, in the United States and Australia. With direct-to-consumer advertising, you often see drug companies creating a need for a drug by going as far as creating a new disease. They do that year in, year out. Turn on your TV. You'll see drugs being hustled for everything ranging from restless feet to restless eyeballs. Feeling old, will take testosterone gel. Feeling like an underperformer, try Viagra. Feeling sad, mad, or overly glad, pop a pink pill or two. You'll feel better. The first step for any accomplished drug hustler is to create the need with an endless advertising blitz. Most of the time, the story doesn't end well for consumers who are told that they're too stressed, they're too fat, they're too sad, and they're too sleep deprived. Step 2. For the drug company hustlers is to promise a dysfunctional, completely dysfunctional FDA that the clinical trials conducted by them for their magic pill is truthful and that they're accurate. They have to tell the FDA that the need for their new drug is so overwhelming that there's no time to delay. Consumers need the drugs and they need them now. Because of that, the rush to the market and the FDA allow almost daily phonied up clinical trials and lack of testing to become the norm with drug oversight. That's the world you're living in. And if someone inside the FDA actually shows some honesty by asking tough questions about the drug industry, well, then the industry unleashes their holy war on that individually simply by calling a few trick monkey congressmen to handle the troublemaker. The same holds true with doctors who become critics after they finally realize that the new wonder drug is killing their patients. They see their hospital privileges revoked. They're often harassed, embarrassed, and discredited by their peers who are owned and operated by the drug industry. We call them biostitutes, and we're going to talk about that tonight. But maybe the most important step in selling useless drugs is to make certain that corporate media is paid so much drug advertising money that they fail to report that drugs are crippling and killing consumers. Big money talks with the corporate media, and that is the rule. Today, you live in a dangerous world where it comes to big marketing pharmaceuticals. Many times, even your treating doctor isn't aware of manipulated clinical data about the dangers of drugs that they prescribe. They assume, and consumers believe, that if it's on the market, well, certainly the FDA has done their job. Certainly the FDA has looked at all this. Well, the next time you're prescribed a drug, go home and research it through social media. through blogs, through chat rooms and advocacy sites. And you're going to learn more about that drug than you're ever going to learn from the FDA or the manufacturers, because the truth is neither one of them is doing their job. Joining me to talk more about this is David Haynes. He's a consumer lawyer. He's a pharmaceutical specialist with the Cochran firm right here in Washington, D.C. David, thank you for joining me. The frenzy for the new drug scams, they're just almost overwhelming, aren't they?
And Big Pharma is creating the frenzy. They're creating it themselves through the sheer weight of their financial firepower. As you said, they're creating the market and the desire through slick advertising in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The doctors are having a situation where the consumer is actually coming in asking to be prescribed the drug. Well,
that's the effect of direct. It used to be a doctor would prescribe the drug. Now they see it on all day long, advertisements. You need this, you got the sniffles, you got a headache, restless feet. Go tell your doctor that you want a new drug. Isn't that how it works? I mean, the statistics are overwhelming, isn't it?
It's exactly right. I mean, millions of dollars are being paid on the advertising, and then also, of course, the pharmaceutical companies are essentially buying doctors to support their clinical research and to convince other doctors as well that these drugs are needed. These are often drugs these are not new drugs. They're often Me Too drugs. They're not a new cure for a fatal disease. These are often just a slight tweak, and the pharmaceutical company has to create the need. So the drugs which are truly novel and innovative, those drugs are selling themselves.
David, you've kind of become an expert in the area of what I call the atrial fib drugs. First of all, explain how ugly that story is. I mean, the people listening to this probably won't believe it, but explain how ugly that story is, where the pharmaceutical industry came in with this baby boomer thing of everybody's going to die of atrial fibs. Let's go sell drugs.
Yeah, it really has been a phenomenon. We're seeing certainly concerns with Xarelto and Eliquis, other drugs in the market as well in this situation where they're creating the market and they're having fatal complications as a result, when really there are perfectly suitable drugs which have time tested, have been on the market for decades, and these new Me Too drugs are coming out, and the pharmaceutical company is trying to convince the consumer that their drug is somehow better.
Well, first of all, if you look at the history of all these drugs, they all knew that the clinical data was bunk. It was completely, most of it on all of these atrial fib drugs, it was gamed in such a way to where it looks like the American public needs it. But if you take a look, you had Coumadin forever. I mean, you have drugs that have been on the market for 60 years that have worked just fine, but all of a sudden the baby boomer generation comes along, atrial fib's a problem, and so they come in, they say, wow, this is going to be a cash bonanza for us, so we're going to take shortcuts on our clinicals, we're going to sell this drug as a designer drug. Isn't that kind of what happened?
It's absolutely what happened. As you said in the opening, the consumer believes that, well, the FDA must have reviewed all of this data and it must be okay. But of course, the FDA can't keep up with these issues, and the pharmaceutical company is such a huge supporter. You have a revolving door at FDA. You have the doctors that are on the hook. You have a number of these companies that are paying tens of millions of dollars to doctors for essentially what are kickbacks to support and go around on the speaking circuit that these drugs are needed to back up the direct-to-consumer marketing that we're seeing, that we allow in this country.
Yeah, it's something you wrote about one time. I think it was $19 million that has been put into trying to get doctors, just by the atrial fib business, trying to get doctors to use these blood clotting drugs. I mean, these drugs that are supposed to save them from atrial fib. But the truth is, people are bleeding to death from products like Xarelto. That's the ugly side of the story.
Horrible hemorrhaging deaths, terrible outcomes when Coumadin or warfarin is a perfectly acceptable, safer alternative. Yet these pharmaceutical companies, the bottom line, they're trying to drive up the stock price. The CEO is there for a matter of a couple of years. Drive it up as high as you can. Don't worry about patient safety. The CEO flies out the back door, parachuting out with a package of tens of millions of dollars, leaving patient deaths and injuries in his wake without seemingly caring about the repercussions.
And we think, don't we, that the FDA is in control of that, don't we? I mean, we really do believe. If you go out on the street and you ask 10 people, does the FDA test drugs? All of them will say yes, And the truth is, they do not test drugs. People believe that, though. They believe the FDA's, surely it's safe because the FDA looked at it. The FDA doesn't even look at the drugs. They take the word of the pharmaceutical company.
It really is more of a reactionary agency, and so after the fact, you know, and then you see drug recalls and you wonder how the drug ever got on the market in the first place. You're right, the testing is not there, and often it's too late that the FDA then will actually take action, and you or a loved one might have been injured.
Well, right now, for example, we're going to see the new trend I think you're going to see is with diabetes drugs. We already saw one phase with diabetes drugs where every week there was some new drug. There's this thing, what is it, Victoza?
Victoza is another one of these Me Too drugs for diabetics. With concern about the blood sugar, but there's a very concerning link to thyroid cancer, which is being developed and being studied. But of course, the consumer doesn't know about that.
Okay, but isn't the goal for a company like the people making Victoza? They simply want to keep it on the market as long as they can. In other words, they know at some day the chickens are going to come home to roost. They know nobody's going to go to prison. They know that they're killing people. They know it's such reckless conduct that people are dying. But they say, keep it on the market because we're making $4 billion a year. We can do that for 10 years. We can pay out $1 billion to people who die. And then, you know what? We've made a lot of money. Isn't that kind of mentality right now?
Unfortunately, it is a very cold clinical cash analysis, as it's seen as just really a cost of doing business. Keep it out there. A lot of these drugs for some of these companies, 1 or 2 drugs, make up a tremendous portion of their market capitalization. They can't afford to have these drugs withdrawn. They're really the cash cows. So they're going to turn a blind eye to what they know is the reality of the medicine.
There's something out there called guinea pig medicine right now, and that is where the clinicals really don't show that the drug is safe, but the FDA allows it to go onto the market anyway, and the way they test it is to use you and people watching this program as guinea pigs. They'll look at the data a year later and say, oh my God, you know, we thought we were right, we thought the clinical data was accurate, but I guess we were wrong. Sorry your grandma died, sorry your mother died, or your brother and your sister died. But you know what? To them, they still make that $1 billion, and it's business as usual, isn't it?
It really is. And so to your viewers out there, they really should be looking at these Me Too drugs that are coming out and think about, this is a new drug on the market. Is it really better? Are there safety concerns that might be coming out in the future? Am I better sticking with Coumadin or warfarin, which is time tested? 10
years. If it's not out there 10 years, I tell you, don't use it. Go investigate it. Go to social media. That's where you'll learn everything. David Haynes, I'm glad you're out there monitoring all this, and thanks for the work that you do in that area. Thanks for joining me. Coming up, you can imagine having your drinking water contaminated with cancer-causing chemicals for more than 50 years. Well, that's exactly what happened in West Virginia and in Ohio, in those communities. Now residents, they're fighting back. But the truth is, DuPont lied to them for more than 50 years. They kept a big secret. More on that right after the break.
There are no citizens or foreigners, allies or enemies.
Spying on close friends and partners is totally unacceptable.
Law-abiders or criminals. There are only objects of surveillance.
Well, they're collecting everything they can collect, and that is everything.
Most people think to stand out in this business, you need to be the first one on top of the story, or the person with the loudest voice or the biggest ratings. In truth, to stand out in the news business, you just need to ask the right questions and demand the right answers. Question more.
Screwed news, should DuPont be facing the corporate death penalty? That company is currently facing thousands of lawsuits from residents from West Virginia to Ohio and all those communities in between where DuPont contaminated drinking water in the area with a cancer-causing toxic chemical. To make matters worse, it appears that the contamination was going on for more than 5 decades. And the icing on the cake? Well, DuPont knew that the water was contaminated with a chemical known as C8, but they did nothing about it. Joining me now for more on this is Ned McWilliams. He's the one fighting this battle, consumer advocate, great lawyer. Ned, welcome. Thanks for joining me. Exactly what is C8? Lay this case out. This is an ugly little case. Tell us how ugly it is.
It is indeed. It's a storyline right out of Aaron Brockovich. It's truly a despicable story of a criminal conduct on the part of DuPont. It's a community of about 80,000 people, and DuPont was using a chemical called C8, which lots of people know it's used in Teflon. And it was contaminated. It was contaminating the drinking water supply for more than 50 years. The company knew it was leaking into the groundwater, into the drinking water. They were going out and secretly testing people's drinking water, testing at hospitals and schools.
Let me ask you something. You threw a lot in there. You mentioned Teflon. C8 is used to make Teflon, and the scientists that looked at this case said that C8 causes testicular cancer, it causes prostate cancer, any other cancers in addition to that?
Yeah, kidney cancer, testicular cancer, and a really terrible disease, ulcerative colitis, which is a form of inflammatory bowel disease.
Okay, so DuPont knew about this. I mean, the notes I have is DuPont knew about it in the early 50s when their own scientists said, hey, you know what? We've got something that's dangerous here. It was so dangerous that 3M actually ended up taking off the market. How do they justify this?
Well, they can't justify it. There's no way they can even just try to justify it. All they're doing now is they're phasing it out. They say they're going to quit using it, and they're sorry. But unfortunately, sorry doesn't help the 80,000 people they've contaminated over the last 50 years. Isn't
this criminal conduct? I mean,
it is.
Isn't this the same as saying to your neighbor, oh, by the way, I didn't want to tell you, but 5 years ago, I started putting arsenic in your swimming pool, and I just forgot to tell you. That would be criminal assault. That's what that is.
Yeah, only thing we worse is if you're drinking your swimming pool water.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, they were secretly putting chemicals in people's body without their permission.
Okay,
and you're right, that's criminal.
So there's a criminal part of this where they've obvious criminal conduct. It is criminal assault. They've committed perjury. Would you agree with that? If I look at the story here, they committed perjury in their reporting to government agencies. Is that accurate?
Yeah, for failing to provide documents, for destroying documents, not giving them to the courts, not giving documents to the EPA. Absolutely.
And obviously there's fraud involved. They committed a fraud on the entire public, which obviously is a criminal fraud. But nobody has gone to jail, have they?
Not yet, but I think the Department of Justice is going to be really interested to see the work we've put together just in the last few months.
Well, Ned, let me ask you something. People misunderstand what criminal conduct requires. And you've got the intent aspect. That is, do they intend to do this? Sometimes conduct is so bad that the conduct rises to recklessness, and that recklessness replaces intent. Is that how the law works?
Yes, sir. That's how the law works. But here we have reckless, but I think we have intent. I think the only debate is about whether or not they thought they were going to do harm. But they intentionally discharged these pollutants, these contaminants into people's drinking water. And they knew or should have known that it was going to cause the harm that it did, especially considering what they were saying internally. They were telling their own employees, don't be exposed to this stuff. You want to avoid exposure. They're telling their own employees internally, this stuff is a carcinogen. They're telling their own employees, you need to wear a respirator when you're around this stuff. Yet they were allowing 80,000 men, women, and children to drink this stuff for 50 years. That's criminal.
Ned, isn't one little part of this, we're short on time here, but one part of this is that women had pregnancy complications when they worked around this product C8 that, as you point out, is a component of Teflon, a Teflon pan that you might use in your kitchen to fry eggs. One component is C8, and it was causing pregnancy complications, birth defects, right?
Yes, sir. Birth defects. They did a little study. There was a anecdotal reports of women having giving birth to babies with birth defects. So they commissioned a study. There was 10 babies born to employees that were exposed to C8. 2 of them, 20%, 20% of the babies born to women that are exposed to C8 in the workplace gave birth to babies with birth defects.
15 seconds, Ned. 15 seconds. What do you say to DuPont tonight? What do you say?
I think it's time they come to the table and they tell the community they apologize and they clean this up.
Thank you, Ned. Appreciate it. Stay on them. DuPont isn't the only company in America that's forgotten about the term corporate responsibility. All across this country, corporations are putting profits ahead of everything, including human lives. One of the many corporations that have gotten hot water recently is General Motors. Last year, General Motors recalled about 2.6 million cars because of a faulty ignition switch. We later found out that the problem could have been fixed easily if General Motors had installed a small piece of metal in that car, a piece that cost 57 cents. Unfortunately, statements made in 2005, GM internal documents that we've seen showed that the company executives decided not to install that 57-cent piece of metal, claiming it was too costly. The auto giant put profits ahead of people's lives, and that prompted Tom to ask if General Motors should get the corporate death penalty. Take a look at what he said.
Speaking of car companies, executives at General Motors have answered the age-old question of how much is a life worth? It's worth 57 cents. Earlier this week, newly installed General Motors CEO Mary Barra was on Capitol Hill testifying before Congress about GM's recall of nearly 2.6 million vehicles because of a faulty ignition switch, a problem that has now cost the deaths of at least 13 people. But more importantly, Barra was answering questions about why GM knew about the ignition switch problem a full decade ago, but chose not to make fixes that would have saved American lives. At a news conference after her testimony before a House subcommittee, Barra told reporters, quote, "I think we in the past had more of a cost culture." In other words, GM cared more about profit margins than people's lives. And at least with the ignition switch debacle, that appears to be the case. When General Motors first learned about the ignition switch problem, executives and engineers got together to discuss how's the company going to respond. And according to GM, company engineers got together in 2005 and proposed solutions to the ignition switch problem, which included installing a small new piece of metal called a switch indent plunger. But statements in 2005 GM internal documents show that the company's executives decided not to fix the ignition switch problem because that small piece of metal was too expensive and an unacceptable cost. So how much did the ignition switch piece that GM executives chose not to fix cost? Probably a lot, right? Not so much. 57 cents. It cost just 57 cents. That's right. According to testimony from House Democrat Diana DeGette of Colorado, the piece that needed to be installed in the faulty cars, the switch indent plunger, cost only 57 cents. When asked about that number, GM spokesman Jim Kane said that presumably it's based on documents and the evidence, so I won't dispute it either. So rather than go out and spend 57 cents per car, or a little over 1.48 million to fix all of its cars with the ignition switch problem, GM essentially performed a cost-benefit analysis and found that fixing the vehicles and saving American lives wasn't worth losing that $1.48 million. Now, to put that in perspective, GM's net income in 2013, just 1 year, was $3.8 billion. So the ignition switch fix would have cost 0.0003%, 0.03 of the company's 2013 net income. As Michael Moore put it, GM has a legal and fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders to make the biggest profits that it can. And if their top people crunch the numbers and can show that they will save more money by not fixing or replacing the part, then that is what they are going to damn well do. Even Daily Show host Jon Stewart was outraged by GM's actions.
They found out in 2001. They studied the problem for 4 years, did an internal cost-benefit analysis using your standard analytic algorithm barometric PE ratio equations and came up with it. Cost too much. Out of curiosity, though, let me ask you a question. How much did it cost?
The cost of replacement, the part, would have been 57 cents.
Well, hold on. When you add it up, It's still a tiny amount of money, actually. It's, for God's sakes, even if you're strapped for cash, GM, you could have found at least that much in the seats of the cars you're fixing.
The GM debacle represents a huge problem with corporate America today, a lack of any real accountability. As Donna Smith, Executive Director of Healthcare for All Colorado and an owner of a recalled GM car, said, the GM recall represents once again how dishonest and greedy many, if not most, U.S. corporations have become. You know, the whole notion of corporate responsibility has been thrown out the window, and it's been replaced with the mentality that profits are king. Many corporations are willing to do just about anything to protect their profits and their bottom line, even if that means accepting that a few people might die as a result, whether in a car crash, an oil rig explosion, or a suicide after a home is foreclosed on. And even worse, they know that nothing will happen by way of punishment. Sure, GM might face a fine or two and have to settle a couple of lawsuits, but at the end of the day, those are just the costs of doing business and piling on the profits. In many cases, they're even all or partly tax deductible. You and I end up paying for it. Those fines and lawsuit settlements are built into the risks that American corporations are willing to take. But it's time for that to change and to put accountability back into the game. It's time to bring back the corporate death penalty. As I chronicle in my book, Unequal Protection, throughout most of the 19th century, an average of 2,000 corporations a year got the corporate death penalty. They were dissolved, their assets were sold off at auction, and their stockholders and managers were left out in the cold. We have done this before, and we should do it again. Corporations should not be able to commit massive crimes, from environmental crimes to banking crimes to defective product crimes, and just get away with it with a slap on the wrist. And they certainly shouldn't be able to choose making a profit over protecting human lives. Until there's the real threat of substantial punishment, like losing the right to do business in America, corporations are going to continue to play fast and loose with the lives and livelihoods of the American people. And Americans are going to continue to suffer. Let's make sure that no one else ever has to lose a loved one because a car company thought that installing a 57-cent piece of metal was less important than being a good corporate member of the community.
Coming up, the makeup of America is changing, and that means the political landscape is too. How is shifting demographics going to affect politics with parties in years to come?
The Terror Act waged on the city of Paris again demonstrates how the West's so-called war on terror works or doesn't work. The extremists on both sides of this divide claim Paris a victory. For the innocent, it's still another senseless and painful tragedy.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
Once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that. I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
Welcome back to The Big Picture. I'm Mike Papantonio in for Tom Hartman. Coming up in this half hour, the common wisdom is that Democrats will benefit greatly from America's changing demographics, but do the numbers add up? And what does a more racially diverse America mean for the future of the Republican Party? More on that in just a moment. In Massachusetts, Senator Elizabeth Warren, she says she's not running for president, but if Warren did run, how would that change our politics for the better, I hope? Tom will have more on that tonight on his Daily Take. As to the rest of the news, demographics could still doom the GOP. After the 2012 elections, the Republican Party conducted an autopsy of its failure to take the White House and retake the Senate. That autopsy concluded that the GOP had to make inroads among minority communities if it wanted to survive as a political party in the 21st century. In the wake of the 2014 midterm elections, though, some Republicans have questioned this line of thinking. They say that their party's big win in November is a sign that the GOP's demographic doom is a long, long way off. But is that really the case? And what can Democrats do to make sure that America's rapidly changing demographics play to their advantage? With me now for more on this is Aaron Watson from the National Trial Lawyers Association. Aaron Watson, welcome.
Hey, Pat, good to be here.
I got to wonder, what is your take on this? This is something that you follow year in, year out, because for the National Trial Lawyers, what's your take on this story?
Pat, I tell you what, back in 2012, all we heard from the Republicans was that they have to go back and regroup and find out how to connect, how to reach minority voters. We don't hear too much of that now. After their success in 2014, we haven't heard much of that storyline. But I tell you, there's a new study that's been put out by the Center for American Progress. And essentially what it said, it's eye-opening that the demographics, minority voters are on the rise in each of the battleground states, and that both Democrats and Republicans have to pay attention to this. In Florida, Ohio, Virginia, they're on the rise. So, you know, it's one thing to say, you know what, well, we had success in 2014, but the thing that they have to keep in mind is that in midterm elections, there's low voter turnout.
Yeah, things are different. Well, let me ask you this. Here's what the other side of it is. Democrats, you know, it's changing, there's no question. In 2043, there's going to be a statistical shift. But until then, aren't you up against the problem? You got gerrymandering taking place. It's still out there. You have voter ID laws that are keeping people away from the polls, primarily minorities. You have what has been described by minority opinion leaders themselves is apathy. There's not the kind of show-up that needs to take place. And so doesn't that give the Republicans a window? Okay, it's a window. If nothing's going to happen until 2043, don't the Republicans have a window to make it even more difficult when that shift does take place? Don't you kind of see they're kind of up to that?
Yeah. Hey, and Pat, you're exactly right. You know, there has always been that issue. And one thing, when you say there's a window for the Republican Party, one thing that we also have to take into consideration is that both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are going to have to capitalize and reach out to minorities. I foresee that with these numbers that came out in this study, that minority voters, you know, are on the rise. I foresee a Republican Party and a Democratic Party that somehow tries to speak to these issues. Say, for example, Pat, one of the issues, at least in the African American community, is this issue with police brutality. It would have been an opportunity for the Republican Party to come in and bring all of their leaders and speak to these issues. You know. And I think that with all the issues going forward, that if the Republican Party can say, you know what, the numbers aren't in our favor, we need to go and speak to gerrymandering. We need to go and speak to police brutality, racial profiling, and speak to those issues that the people care about.
In other words, Aaron, what I'm hearing you say is the GOP could actually do the unthinkable, and that is to take the high ground, to say we are a different party. We're not a party of crackers. You know, we are a party of people who care about people. But is it built that way? I mean, if you really take a look at leadership from the top down, aren't we a generation off of anybody even thinking that maybe we ought to just stand tall and maybe we ought to take some moral high ground and do the right thing? Do away with these voter ID scams. Do away with gerrymandering. Take up for minorities on things like immigration. Take up for minorities on things like police brutality. You're in the middle of the fight every day. Okay?
Yes.
In the middle of that fight, does that sound even realistic to you?
Listen, I tell you what, back in you know, when the Republicans were putting out this message that, hey, you know what, we want to connect with minority voters, once they realized the effect that minority voters had, that's all you heard them talk about. We want to connect with you. We want to find out what your issues are. I think that the more that the Republicans embrace the fact that minority voters are increasing and that white voters are decreasing. You know, these are hard statistics that they're going to have to start speaking to these issues in the minority community. I don't think it's far-fetched, but one thing you'll find is that a little bit goes a long way. Had the Republican Party come out and said, you know, at the onset of the Mike Brown situation, Ferguson situation, that this is a problem. This is a problem that we want to address. You know, just coming out and speaking to the people, to those issues, a little bit goes a long way.
Okay,
and
speak to me right now in your heart of hearts, as somebody who's in the midst of the fight, who knows this story very well. In your heart of hearts, what has to happen? What has to happen within the Republican Party to make any meaningful ground change to go after minorities?
I think that the Republican leaderships, they need to give a voice. If they say, you know what, we want your vote, they need to give a voice that they are concerned about these issues. It's not enough to say, you know what, we want your votes, we want to connect to you. It takes some brass, it takes boldness to say, you know what, going forward, we want to address gerrymandering. We want to talk about racial profiling. We understand that these are issues and that, you know, there's new leadership in the Republican Party. You know, they recently elected some African-American leaders in the Republican Party. Get those leaders out on the front lines. But until they come forward and speak to the people on their issues.
But Aaron, real quickly, aren't those bootstrap African-Americans that have said, I've made it here, to hell with everybody else below me? I mean, isn't that what we're seeing? Aren't we seeing that within the Republican Party when they move African Americans into the party? I got 30 seconds. What's your quick take on it?
Listen, we see it all the time, Pap. And I tell you what, in the face of this study, and you mentioned the fact that in 2043, that the minorities will be the majority. In the face of these increasing numbers, those African American leaders in the Republican Party, the white leaders in the Republican Party, they need to speak to these issues. And until they speak to the people, the status will be the same.
Aaron, got to go. Aaron Watson, thank you. Thank you for being out there on this issue. All questions about demographics aside, the most important thing Democrats need to do to win big in 2016 is to educate the American people about the importance of government. Tom explains why in a recent Daily Take. Check it out.
Democrats must embrace a pro-government platform instead of running away from it. Those were the sentiments of Senator Chuck Schumer today in a speech given at the National Press Club. Talking about the reasons for Democrats' losses on Election Day, Schumer said that those losses were proof that the American people and middle class want a government that will work more effectively for them. He went on to say that for the first time ever, the middle class has lost faith in the American dream. Take a look.
For the first time in American history, middle-class incomes have been in decline for over a decade, and the grand optimism of America and the American dream is itself in jeopardy. The 2014 election results can be explained this way. During 2013, neither party convinced the middle class that they had an effective way to get them out of this morass.
But it wasn't always like this. As Schumer pointed out, a pro-government mentality dominated America and the political landscape from the days of FDR until 1980 when Ronald Reagan came to town. With FDR's New Deal policies and programs, Americans saw that government can strengthen the middle class, improve the economy, and protect everyone's ability to live the American dream. For several generations, Americans trusted our government's ability to improve living conditions for the working class. And as a result, Democrats stayed in power for a long time. Then Reagan happened, and everything changed. First, as Schumer points out, the Democratic Party veered off course while Reagan was president and abandoned its working class base. Second, Schumer says that because the Democratic Party had been so successful at creating a stable economy that worked for everyone for so long, people began to think they no longer needed government, that they were just fine on their own. You know, I'm doing this. Reagan capitalized on those sentiments and was able to successfully create an anti-government mentality that exists to this day and that helped fuel the Republican landslide on Election Day. But this anti-government mentality that exists today isn't just some random phenomenon. There are lots of reasons for it, as Senator Schumer pointed out.
When government fails to prosecute those who work in financial institutions, some of which were propped up or bailed out by the government, for what seems on its face blatant fraud, Americans feel that government's not working for them. When CEOs and executives pay less in taxes than their secretaries, Americans feel government is not working for them.
So what can be done to restore the American people's trust in the Democratic Party's and our government's ability to protect and strengthen the middle class? How do we go back to the pre-1980 days? Schumer suggested the Democrats should start taking more of a populist approach. Take a look.
So an element of populism, even for those of us who don't consider ourselves populists, is necessary to open the door before we can rally people to the view that a strong government program must be implemented. And this is particularly true for the one-third in the American middle who are right now neither pro nor anti-government and who would not be opposed to an active government, but who first must be convinced it will be on their side.
One of the biggest takeaways from the 2014 election is that nationally, progressive ideas and policies are actually very, very popular. All across America, progressive ballot initiatives won big, and progressive candidates won. Those are the very same progressive ideas and policies that made Americans trust the Democratic Party and our government for over 4 decades, from the 30s to the 80s. And those are the ideas and policies that built both the Democratic Party and the American middle class. As the old saying goes, sometimes you have to look back in order to go forward. If the Democratic Party is serious about taking back Washington in 2016, then it needs to embrace its base and restore Americans' faith in our government.
Coming up, Elizabeth Warren has said over and over again that she's not running for president. But if she decides to run, she'd make a great candidate. Tom's going to explain that on tonight's Daily Take.
For them, there are no citizens or foreigners, allies or enemies.
Spying on close friends and partners is totally unacceptable.
Law-abiders or criminals. There are only objects of surveillance.
It's not an ideological issue because you have Democratic presidents, you have Republican presidents, you have the far left, the far right. They all agree on one thing. We all want to know what everybody else is doing. Spying is in the American gene pool, unfortunately.
5 seconds. And over the mic is all feeling to go.
Did you know the press is the only industry specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
Stand by.
That's because a free and open press is critical to our democracy.
Track Alpha. Roll Alpha. Stand by, camera 1.
I'm Tom Hartman, and on this show, we reveal the big picture of what's actually going on in the world. We go beyond identifying the problem.
We try to fix it.
Rational debate and a real discussion of the critical issues facing America.
Stand by on camera, go.
Ready to join the movement? Then welcome to the big picture.
Welcome back. Another day, another victory for Elizabeth Warren. For months now, the Massachusetts senator has been leading the fight against the nomination of Wall Street banker Antonio Weiss to the Treasury Department. We can now say for certain that the fight was a big success. Over the weekend, Weiss wrote to the president and asked him to be taken off the running for Treasury, saying that, well, he didn't want to be a distraction to the administration. You think? Well, the White House consented, and now they're looking for somebody to replace Weiss. This is a huge win for progressives and the progressive movement. But can Democrats maintain the momentum? And what should Elizabeth Warren's fight against Weiss tell us about her presidential plans? With me now for more is Farron Cousins, co-host of the Ring of Fire radio show. Let me ask you, just how big a victory is Antonio Weiss and pulling his name from this run here for Treasury? It seems big.
It is. It's huge. You know, Antonio Weiss was the guy who basically invented the idea of the corporate inversion, where a company like Burger King, for example, would essentially move their headquarters on paper overseas to avoid paying U.S. taxes. He's the guy, instrumental architect in creating that entire concept, and this was going to be the third highest ranking official at the U.S. Treasury. I mean, you know, it can't get any more backwards than that in terms of the fox guarding the hen house. And then Elizabeth Warren, you know, one of the strongest voices in America today by any measure, was out there saying exactly what the American people wanted to hear. They wanted to hear somebody standing up and telling the truth about Antonio Weiss, telling the truth about the Obama administration's coziness with Wall Street bankers. And so it's a huge victory for progressives. And Elizabeth Warren, along with Bernie Sanders, have been leading the charge on this. And they've really become the voice of the entire progressive populist movement.
Farron, let me ask you this. The progressive voice pushback has been so rare. I mean, the progressive voice in the past has been like a tree falling in the forest where nobody really even knows the damn tree fell. But part of the problem is that they would always show up with this warm, fuzzy message. It is, gee whiz, you know, let's try to get along. And all of a sudden comes Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and, you know, other people in the Democratic Party, Sherrod Brown, Alan Grayson, that say, you get the impression that the rabid right might be understanding that it's a new day out there, that angry and loud pushback by angry, loud, pale, stale white guys doesn't work anymore, because now you have people pushing back on the other side. We saw it with Larry Summers. We saw it with Social Security. We saw it with the war in Syria. We saw it with Keystone. What's different now? How do you put your finger on what's different about all this?
Well, I have two theories about it. One, obviously the most recent one, is that these midterm losses in 2014 really woke up the Democratic Party, especially the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, not the Beltway Democrats who will always continue to be more and more Republican-like. But those losses woke them up, and they realized you can't sit there and try to compromise with somebody like Louis Gohmert or somebody like Ted Cruz. There is no rational conversation with people like that. There's no rational conversation with a 65, 70-year-old man who believes that science is just wrong and climate change doesn't exist.
You get the impression. Let me ask you something. Let me ask you something about that. Do you get the impression, as you look at this this new idea of what a Democratic voice should sound like? I hate to use Democrats. Democrats, for the most part, are not progressive. Sounds like a wake-up call, but they're not. But all of a sudden, for decades, you've had Democrats that have been hustling progressives by throwing them bones on social issues. You know, maybe it's DOMA, maybe it's same-sex marriage, the environment, you name it. They've been these social issue bones while they've ignored key Wall Street economic issues on behalf of Wall Street. Have progressives been hustled up to this point?
See, to an extent, yes. But the bigger problem lies within the Democratic Party makeup, because you do have so many different factions within the party, and they unfortunately seem to take up a single issue, not realizing that all issues need to be related, need to be connected. The labor movement needs to get behind the environmental movement. Environmental movement needs to team up with the equal rights and LGBT movement. You know, if there's one thing that the Republicans really are great at, they can bring together all of these different interest groups that seemingly have nothing in common and band together to actually get things done. Terrible things, but they get them done. The Democrats have been slow to realize that we're all in this together. You know, let's work together. Let's not just say that my issue is more important than your issue. So I think we're seeing a shift in that.
Has social media done that? I mean, 15 years ago, we didn't have a social media that pushed back on issues like Antonio Weiss. We simply didn't have that. I mean, you know, the only loudmouth you had out there was, you know, Rush Limbaugh or the other crazies. But now you have a social media pushing back. Does that make the formula a little different?
Absolutely, and that was, as I mentioned earlier with the two parts, midterm losses were one. The second is the availability of information and the social media pushback. You know, they can get on there, the White House can make an announcement and say, I nominate Antonio Weiss to the Treasury, and within 5 minutes, there could be 1 million tweets with people saying why that's such a bad idea.
Right.
Everything today is instant. It's instant pushback, and that's what we've needed for so long.
And so this show, for example, The Big Picture, Tom does the show every night, but then they take those pieces of the show and they put it out in social media, and it bounces all around social media. And we do the same thing with Ring of Fire, and any good progressive show does it. That is having an impact, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. You know, back in 2004 is when the Air America radio network started. Tom Hartman and Ed Schultz both had progressive radio shows before that. But up until that point, there was no major outlet. Air America came along, and while it didn't succeed, it helped to birth that movement along with Tom Hartman and along with Ed Schultz and all of these people. And from there, it's grown into essentially, you know, this massive network of bloggers and YouTube channels and Facebook pages and Twitter users. And so we do have this massive online infrastructure that is really kicking butt compared to Republicans.
Got to get out of here, but progressives are better at it than the other side. Farron Cousins, thank you for joining me. Keep up the great work. Although she said time and time again that no, she's not running for president, Elizabeth Warren would make a great candidate. Tom explained why in his recent Daily Take. Check it out.
Over the past few weeks, Elizabeth Warren has emerged as a leader for progressives on Capitol Hill. She led the charge against the part of the Cromnibus that gutted our financial regulations, and she's still fighting the White House over its nomination of bankster Antonio Weiss as Undersecretary of Domestic Finance in the Treasury Department. While those of us on the left are thrilled that Senator Warren is coming into her own as a voice for change in Washington, the right, well, they're not so thrilled. In fact, they're downright terrified. During an episode of Outnumbered yesterday, Fox so-called news host Melissa Francis said that as far as Wall Street is concerned, Elizabeth Warren was the devil, and then warned that her populist message could be a big winner in 2016.
And I can tell you from talking to people in the financial industry, in banking, on Wall Street, they think she is actually the devil. I mean, without question. Elizabeth Warren is the devil. So they're going to put any money that they have behind Hillary Clinton, which should be a help. But it'll be interesting to see because she's capitalizing on this moment in time, Elizabeth Warren.
But it's populist, Bernie. It's populist. I mean,
Melissa's right to be scared because Elizabeth Warren represents one of, if not the biggest, threat to Republicans winning the presidency in 2016. Warren is essentially a populist. And if there was one good sign from this year's midterm elections, it's that Americans of all stripes, even those living in red states, support a populist agenda. If Elizabeth Warren were to run for president on a populist platform, it could help the Democratic Party reclaim the so-called red states. But a Warren presidential run wouldn't just be good for the Democratic Party, it would be good for the entire country, because it would change how we talk about politics. Like Teddy Roosevelt before her, Warren doesn't just take the fight across the aisle. She also sticks up to those people within her own party who do more for special interests than they do for everyday people. Her fight against part of a government spending bill that was supported by most of the Democratic leadership and the White House is a great example of this kind of no-party populism. For Warren, it's not about left versus right, Democrats versus Republicans. It's about insiders versus outsiders. That's a really important point. And it's the single most important reason why she should become our president in 2016. In her memoir, Fighting Chance, Warren quotes Larry Summers as telling her that when people get to Washington, they have a choice. They can either be insiders or outsiders. Outsiders, Summers explained, can say whatever they want, but people on the inside don't listen to them. Insiders, however, get lots of access and a chance to push their ideas. People, powerful people, listen to what they have to say. Summers' message here was clear. You want to get things done in Washington, you have to follow the rules and avoid ruffling people's feathers. But if we've learned anything over the past few weeks, it's that Larry Summers, as has been the case at virtually every consequential moment in his entire career, was totally and completely wrong. By speaking out about Antonio Weiss, by speaking out about the government's spending omnibus bill, Elizabeth Warren is proving that being an outsider works. She's proving that populism cuts across the left-right divide. She's proving that acting like an outsider rearranges the debate so that it's about us versus them, with us being the American people and them being the insiders and special interest groups who use government to pad their pockets. An Elizabeth Warren presidential run would give us a chance to have a national conversation about these issues. And even if she doesn't make it out of the primaries, this kind of primary debate, these topics being discussed, populism being injected into our political campaigns, and hopefully pushing Hillary Clinton or whoever the nominee is to the left, our country would be a lot healthier for having had that discussion than having not had it. Senator Warren has said again and again that she's not going to run for president in 2016. But that's the exact same thing a junior Illinois senator named Barack Obama said back in 2006. And look where he is now. It's time for a real national conversation about populism and democracy. You can go over to moveon.org to tell Elizabeth Warren that you want her to run for president.
And that's the way it is tonight, Tuesday, January 13th, 2015. Don't forget, democracy depends on you. So get out there and do something. I'm Mike Papantonio. I'll see you tomorrow night.